At just 8 years old, Marcus became his mother's emotional caretaker, wiping away her tears and promising her that everything would be okay while his father worked late nights and his golden child sister lived carefree. For years, he sacrificed his childhood to be the adult his mother needed, listening to her complaints about his father, comforting her during breakdowns, and taking responsibility for her happiness. He learned to read her moods, anticipate her needs, and suppress his own emotions to keep the peace. Now, 25 years later, Marcus has built a successful life as a therapist, helping others heal from family trauma. But when his mother suddenly accuses him of being the reason her marriage failed and her life fell apart, everything he believed about their relationship crumbles. She claims his neediness as a child drove his father away, that his emotional demands ruined her chances of happiness, and that he manipulated her into depending on him. As Marcus struggles to understand how the woman he sacrificed everything for could rewrite their history so cruelly, he must confront the devastating truth about parentification, emotional abuse, an impossible burden placed on children who become their parents' therapists. This is a story about a son who gave his mother his childhood, only to be blamed for stealing hers. Will Marcus find the strength to break free from the toxic cycle that has defined his entire existence, or will his mother's accusations destroy the fragile sense of self he's worked so hard to build? Subscribe and tell me in the comments what you think about this devastating family situation. Have you ever been blamed for something that wasn't your responsibility as a child? The first time I remember truly understanding that something was wrong with our family, I was 8 years old, sitting on the edge of my mother's bed at 2 a.m, holding her hand while she cried about how lonely she felt. My father was working another late shift at the factory. My sister Emma was fast asleep in her perfectly decorated princess bedroom down the hall, and I was there, always there, being the shoulder my mother needed to lean on. "You're such a good boy, Marcus," she whispered through her tears that night, her fingers gripping mine with desperate intensity. "You understand me better than anyone else in this house. I don't know what I'd do without you." Even at 8, those words felt heavy, like a responsibility I wasn't sure I wanted but couldn't refuse. I remember looking at her tear-stained face in the dim light of her bedside lamp and feeling this overwhelming need to fix whatever was broken inside her. It wasn't the first time I'd found myself in that position, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Growing up in our modest 2-story house in Millfield, Ohio, I learned early that my role in the family was different from Emma's. While she got to be the carefree daughter who brought home art projects and dance recital programs that Mom would proudly display on the refrigerator, I became the emotional support system that kept our household functioning. Emma was a golden child, beautiful, talented, effortlessly charming. She could do no wrong in our mother's eyes. When she forgot to clean her room, it was endearing. When she talked back, it was spunky. When she needed something, the whole family mobilized to make it happen. But when I needed comfort, when I had nightmares or felt scared or just wanted to be held like any normal child, somehow the conversation always turned back to Mom's problems. "Oh, honey, Mommy's having such a hard day," she would say, her voice trembling with self-pity. "Can you just sit with me for a while? You always make me feel better." And so I did. I sat with her through countless afternoons when she would pour out her heart about how my father didn't appreciate her, how she felt trapped in a life she never wanted, how she had given up her dreams to raise ungrateful children. I learned to nod sympathetically, to offer tissues, to say things like, "I'm sorry you feel sad, Mommy, and Daddy should be nicer to you." I became fluent in the language of adult emotions before I even understood my own. The pattern was so ingrained in our family dynamic that it seemed normal. Mom would have one of her episodes, crying spells, angry outbursts, days where she wouldn't get out of bed, and I would automatically go into caretaker mode. I'd bring her tea, sit quietly while she vented, and absorb whatever emotional overflow she needed to release. Emma was always conveniently absent during these moments, either at a friend's house or at one of her many activities, protected by the invisible shield that seemed to deflect all of Mom's neediness away from her. My father, Richard, worked 60-hour weeks at the automotive plant and seemed perpetually exhausted. When he was home, he moved through the house like a ghost, grabbing a beer from the fridge and disappearing into the garage or the basement workshop. He had learned, I think, to make himself scarce whenever Mom's emotional temperature started rising. Sometimes I would catch him looking at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Was it guilt, relief, gratitude that I was handling what he couldn't or wouldn't handle himself? "Your boy's growing up fast," I heard him say to Mom once, not knowing I was listening from the hallway. "Maybe too fast." "Marcus understands me," she replied defensively. "He has an old soul. Some children are just born with more emotional intelligence. But I wasn't born with emotional intelligence. I was forced to develop it as a survival mechanism. By the time I was 10, I could predict Mom's moods better than a weather forecast. The slight tightening around her eyes that meant she was about to start crying. The way she would sigh dramatically while doing dishes, signaling that she needed someone to ask what was wrong. The particular tone of voice she used when she wanted me to side with her against Dad, or Emma, or whoever had failed to meet her emotional needs that day. School became my refuge, the only place where I wasn't responsible for managing anyone else's feelings. I threw myself into academics, partly because learning felt like the one thing that was truly mine, and partly because bringing home good grades was one of the few ways I could get positive attention from Mom without having to comfort her first. But even my achievements felt tainted by the knowledge that they were primarily valuable as mood boosters for my mother. "Look at this report card," she would announce to Dad, waving my straight A's in the air. "At least one of my children appreciates everything I do for them." The implication was always there, that my academic success was somehow proof of her superior parenting, evidence that her emotional dependence on me was actually beneficial rather than harmful. And I believed it, at least partially. When you're raised to be someone's emotional support animal, you start to derive your sense of worth from how well you can perform that function. The summer I turned 12, things escalated dramatically. Dad had been working overtime almost every night for months, trying to save money for Emma's expensive dance camp. Mom's resentment about his absence reached a boiling point, and she began confiding in me about things no child should ever hear. Details about their sex life, or lack thereof, financial worries, her suspicions that Dad might be having an affair with a co-worker, her regrets about getting married so young and having children before she had a chance to figure out who she really was. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I had waited. She told me one evening as we sat on the front porch swing, watching Emma practice cartwheels in the yard. "I was so young when I had you kids. I barely knew myself. I remember feeling a sharp stab of guilt, as if my very existence was somehow an imposition on her happiness. I'm sorry, Mom." I said automatically the words that had become my default response to her pain. "Oh, sweetheart, it's not your fault," she replied, but her tone suggested otherwise. "You're the one good thing that came out of all this. You're my little helper, my emotional support. I don't know how I would have survived these years without you to talk to." That phrase, emotional support, stuck with me for years. It wasn't until I was in graduate school studying psychology that I would learn the term parentification and understand how profoundly wrong it was for a parent to use their child as a therapist, confidant, and emotional regulator. But at 12, all I knew was that my mother needed me in a way that felt both special and suffocating. The breaking point came during my freshman year of high school. I had started staying after school for academic clubs and volunteer activities, partly because I genuinely enjoyed them and partly because they gave me a legitimate excuse to be away from home during Mom's most emotionally volatile hours. I was finally beginning to feel like a normal teenager, making friends, developing interests that had nothing to do with managing my mother's feelings. But Mom didn't see my growing independence as healthy development. She saw it as abandonment. The evening I came home late from a debate team meeting to find her sobbing at the kitchen table, I knew I was in trouble before she even started talking. "You don't care about me anymore," she accused, her mascara streaked down her cheeks in dramatic black lines. "Ever since you started all these activities, you never have time for your mother. I sit here alone every day, and you're off having fun with your friends like you don't have a family." I tried to explain that my activities were important for college applications, that other kids my age were doing the same things, that I still spent plenty of time at home. But every rational argument I made only seemed to make her more upset. "I sacrificed everything for you children," she continued, her voice rising to that particular pitch that meant she was building toward one of her epic meltdowns. "I gave up my youth, my dreams, my body, my entire identity to be your mother. And this is how you repay me? By treating me like I don't exist?" The guilt was overwhelming. Here was this woman who claimed to have sacrificed everything for me, and I was apparently too selfish to spend a few hours listening to her problems. So I quit debate team. I stopped staying after school. I went back to being her emotional support system, but something had fundamentally shifted in our dynamic. The resentment was no longer hidden beneath her neediness. It was right there on the surface, poisonous and blame-filled. "You used to be such a sweet little boy," she would say with a sigh whenever I showed any sign of normal teenage behavior. "I don't know what happened to you. What happened was that I was growing up, developing my own identity, trying to become a person instead of just a function. But in our family system, that was seen as a betrayal rather than a natural developmental process." High school became a series of negotiations between my desire for independence and my mother's emotional demands. Every social invitation was met with guilt trips about leaving her alone. Every achievement that took me away from home, even temporarily, was framed as evidence that I was becoming selfish and ungrateful. She had a way of making me feel guilty for having friends, for enjoying school, for wanting anything that didn't directly benefit her emotional well-being. Meanwhile, Emma continued to float through life like a golden princess. She could stay out late with friends, date boys, focus on her own interests, all without a single guilt trip from Mom. When I pointed out this obvious double standard, Mom would get defensive and angry. "Emma doesn't know me the way you do," she said once, the words hitting me like a physical blow. "You've always been my special boy, the one who understands me. Emma is different. She's more like your father. But you and I have a bond that's deeper than that." Even then, at 16, I knew there was something deeply wrong with that statement. Children don't owe their parents emotional labor. Children aren't supposed to have special bonds that require them to sacrifice their childhood for their parents' psychological well-being. But I had been so thoroughly conditioned to see myself as responsible for Mom's happiness that I couldn't imagine a different way of being. The worst part was how she would use my empathy against me. She knew I was sensitive, that I hated seeing people in pain, that I would do almost anything to avoid conflict. So whenever I tried to establish boundaries or assert my own needs, she would become inconsolably upset, cry about how much I was hurting her, how I was becoming just like my father, cold and selfish and incapable of love. "I thought you were different," she would sob. "I thought you actually cared about me. But you're just like every other man. You only care about yourself." Those words would cut deep because they played into my worst fear, that I really was selfish, that one in my own life made me a terrible son, that my mother's obvious pain was my fault for being insufficiently devoted to her needs. By my senior year, I was accepted to several colleges, including a prestigious program in psychology 3 states away. The decision should have been obvious. It was an incredible opportunity, exactly what I had been working toward for years. But the thought of telling Mom that I was planning to move so far away filled me with dread. When I finally worked up the courage to share the news, her reaction was worse than I had anticipated. She didn't just cry. She had what could only be described as a complete emotional breakdown. She accused me of abandoning her, of being ungrateful for everything she had done for me, of choosing strangers over family. She brought up every sacrifice she claimed to have made, every time I had comforted her as a child, every moment of emotional support I had provided over the years. "After everything I've given you," she screamed, her face red with rage and tears. "This is how you repay me? By running away, by leaving me here with a husband who doesn't talk to me and a daughter who only cares about herself." The guilt was crushing. Here I was, finally having the chance to build my own life, and all I could think about was how much pain I was causing my mother. The little boy who had held her hand through countless nights of crying couldn't bear the thought of being the source of her suffering. But this time, I didn't back down. With the help of my high school counselor, who had begun to recognize the unhealthy dynamics of my family, I held firm in my decision to attend college out of state. It was one of the hardest things I had ever done, watching my mother treat my natural desire for independence as a personal betrayal. The day I left for college, she couldn't even bring herself to say goodbye properly. She hugged Emma tearfully, fussed over her packing, and promised call every day. But when it came time to see me off, she was cold and distant, making it clear that my departure was a wound she might never forgive. "I hope you're happy," were her final words to me, delivered with the kind of bitter resignation that was meant to follow me for miles. College was a revelation. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who didn't need me to manage their emotions. I could have conversations that weren't centered around someone else's problems. I could make decisions based on my own interests and desires rather than calculating how they would affect my mother's mental state. I could just be a normal young adult, figuring out who I was without the constant pressure of being someone's emotional support system. But the freedom came with its own challenges. I had spent so many years defining myself through my ability to comfort others that I had no idea who I actually was when that function was removed. I struggled with anxiety and depression, often feeling guilty for enjoying my independence. Every phone call home was fraught with tension, as Mom would subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, remind me of how much she was suffering in my absence. "Emma never calls," she would complain. "Your father barely speaks to me. I'm all alone in this house, and you're off having the time of your life." The implication was always there, that my happiness was somehow contingent on her misery, that by building my own life, I was actively harming her. It took years of therapy to begin untangling those toxic beliefs and understanding that my mother's emotional well-being was not my responsibility. I majored in psychology, drawn to understanding the dynamics that had shaped my childhood. Learning about boundaries, healthy relationships, and the devastating effects of parentification was both liberating and heartbreaking. I began to see my family with new eyes, recognizing patterns of emotional abuse that I had previously accepted as normal expressions of love. The term emotional incest was particularly difficult to process. It described the inappropriate emotional intimacy my mother had forced on me, using me as her confidant, her emotional husband, her therapist from the age of 8. I learned that children who are parentified often struggle with relationships as adults, having been trained to prioritize others' needs over their own, to feel responsible for emotions that aren't theirs to manage. Graduate school in clinical psychology felt like a natural progression. I was driven by a desire to understand trauma, to help other people break free from toxic family dynamics, to use my own painful experiences as a source of healing for others. It was rewarding work, but also forcing to confront just how much damage had been done by those early years of emotional parentification. I specialize in family therapy, working with adults who had experienced childhood emotional abuse and neglect. Many of my clients had stories that mirror my own, children who had been forced to grow up too fast, to be their parents' emotional caretakers, to sacrifice their own development for their caregiver's psychological needs. Helping them heal became a way of healing myself. During my residency, I met Sarah, a fellow psychology student who had grown up in a healthy, functional family. Being with her was like discovering a foreign language. The way her parents respected her boundaries, supported her independence, and took responsibility for their own emotions was completely alien to my experience. Through our relationship, I began to understand what normal family dynamics actually looked like. Sarah was patient as I worked through my issues with guilt, people-pleasing, and the deep-seated belief that love was conditional on my ability to fix other people's problems. She helped me see that the anxious, hyper-vigilant way I moved through the world, always scanning for other people's emotional needs, always ready to sacrifice my own comfort for someone else's well-being, wasn't normal or healthy. "You don't owe anyone your peace of mind," she told me once after I had spent an entire evening obsessing over whether I had somehow hurt a friend's feelings by declining a social invitation. "Your mother trained you to believe that other people's emotions are your responsibility, but that's not how healthy relationships work." It was during this period of growth and healing that I made the difficult decision to limit contact with my family, not cut them off entirely, but establish firm boundaries around what I would and wouldn't discuss, how often I would call, and what kind of emotional support I was willing to provide. It was terrifying. The little boy in me was convinced that setting boundaries would destroy my mother, that protecting my own mental health was tantamount to abandoning someone who needed me. But I did it anyway. I started screening my calls, limiting phone conversations to specific topics, and refusing to be drawn into her emotional dramas. When she would try to guilt me into visiting more often or providing the kind of emotional support I had given her as a child, I would calmly redirect the conversation or end the call. The response was predictably explosive. Mom accused me of being cold, ungrateful, and selfish. She brought up every sacrifice she had ever made, every time I had comforted her as a child, every moment of love she claimed to have given me. She painted my boundaries as cruelty, my healthy development as betrayal. "I don't even recognize you anymore," she said during one particularly difficult phone call. The sweet little boy I raised would never treat his mother this way. And that's when I realized the truth. She didn't want to grow up. She wanted to keep me frozen at 8 years old, sitting on the edge of her bed, holding her hand while she cried. My development into a healthy, independent adult was seen as a loss rather than achievement, a rejection rather than natural progression. Years passed. I finished my residency, started my own practice, married Sarah, and began building the kind of life I had never imagined possible. We bought a house in a quiet neighborhood, traveled together, developed friendships based on mutual respect rather than emotional neediness. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. not responsible for anyone else's happiness, not walking on eggshells to avoid triggering someone's emotional breakdown. I maintained minimal contact with my family, sending birthday cards and Christmas gifts, making brief phone calls on holidays. Emma and I had developed a cordial but distant relationship. She seemed to understand on some level that our childhood experiences had been vastly different, though we never discussed it directly. Dad and I barely spoke beyond polite exchanges of pleasantries. But Mom continued to view my boundaries as temporary rebelliousness, something I would eventually grow out of and return to our old dynamic. She would test those boundaries constantly, calling during my work hours with emotional emergencies, showing up at my office unannounced when she was in the neighborhood, trying to recreate the enmeshed relationship we had when I was a child. Each time I held firm, refusing to be drawn back into the role of her emotional caretaker, she would become more resentful and accusatory. But I had learned, through therapy and healthy relationships, that her emotional reactions were not my responsibility. I could feel compassion for her pain without taking ownership of it. Last month, everything changed. I received a call from Emma, not the usual brief check-in, but a longer conversation filled with tension and uncertainty. She told me that Mom had been talking about me constantly, rewriting our family history in ways that made me the villain of every story. According to Emma, Mom had convinced herself that I was the reason Dad had become distant, that my neediness as a child had driven him away, that my emotional demands had ruined her marriage and her life. "She's saying things that don't make any sense, Marcus," Emma said, her voice troubled. "She claims that you manipulated her into depending on you emotionally, that you were somehow controlling her when you were just a kid. She's telling anyone who will listen that you destroyed our family." The accusation was so absurd, so completely opposite the reality of our relationship, that I initially dismissed it as one of Mom's typical guilt trip strategies. But Emma's concern was real, and over the following weeks, I began to hear from other family members and family friends about the story Mom was spreading. In her revised version of events, I was no longer the parentified child who had sacrificed his own emotional development to serve as a therapist. Instead, I was painted as a manipulative little boy who had somehow convinced his mother to confide in him, who had deliberately created an unhealthy dynamic for my own benefit, who had driven a wedge between my parents through my demands for attention. She was telling people that my father had started working late to avoid coming home to a house where his son was acting as his wife's emotional husband. She claimed that my neediness had prevented her from developing a normal relationship with Emma, that my constant emotional crises had consumed all her energy and attention. She even suggested that my decision to become a therapist was evidence of my manipulative nature, that I had always been drawn to controlling other people's emotions. The most devastating part of her revisionist history was how she framed my boundaries as adult abuse. According to her narrative, I was now punishing her for the love she had given me as a child, withholding affection and support as revenge for imagined slights, using my education and professional status to make her feel small and inadequate. "He turned me into his emotional slave when he was little," she apparently told my aunt, "and now he's abandoned me completely. After everything I sacrificed for that boy, he treats me like I'm nothing." When I first heard about these accusations, I felt the familiar childhood panic rise in my chest, the desperate need to fix things, to explain myself, to somehow make her understand the truth. But I also felt something new, a clear adult understanding that this was exactly the kind of manipulation I had spent years learning to recognize and resist. This was gaslighting on a massive scale, not just rewriting our shared history, but completely inverting the power dynamic to make her the victim of a relationship in which I had been the one with no power, no choice, No ability to consent to role, I was forced to play. But knowing that intellectually didn't make it hurt any less emotionally. The little boy who had spent so many nights comforting his crying mother was devastated by her betrayal. How could the woman who had claimed to love me more than anyone, who had said I was her special boy, her emotional support, her closest confidant, how could she now claim that our relationship had been my fault, my manipulation, my destruction of her happiness? That's when I decided to do something I had never done before. I was going to confront her directly, not as a guilty child seeking forgiveness, but as an adult who deserved honesty about our shared past. I was going to drive to Ohio, walk into that house where I had learned to be responsible for emotions that weren't mine, and demand an explanation for how she could rewrite 25 years of parentification as my childhood manipulation of her. The 3-hour drive to Millfield gave me plenty of time to think about what I wanted to say, how I wanted to approach the conversation. Part of me was terrified that facing her would send me right back into old patterns of guilt and people-pleasing. But a larger part of me was angry, rightfully angry, at how she was trying to blame an 8-year-old boy for the emotional abuse he had endured. I had spent my entire adult life building healthy relationships, learning to set boundaries, helping other people heal from similar trauma. I wasn't going to let my mother's revisionist history undo all of that progress. I wasn't going to accept responsibility for a dynamic that had been forced on me before I was old enough to understand what was happening. As I pulled into the familiar driveway of my childhood home, I noticed how small everything looked. The house that had once seemed so large and imposing was just a modest 2-story in a working-class neighborhood. The front porch where I had listened to so many of Mom's emotional confessions looked weathered and tired. Even the swing where she used to tell me about her regrets was hanging slightly crooked on rusty chains. I sat in my car for several minutes, steeling myself for what was about to happen. In a few moments, I was going to walk through that front door and confront the woman who had shaped my entire childhood around her emotional needs. I was going to look her in the eye and ask her how she could blame me for a relationship that I had never chosen, never controlled, never had the power to change. The little boy in me wanted to turn around, drive home, and pretend this conversation never needed to happen. But the man I had become, the therapist, the husband, the person who had worked so hard to heal from this exact kind of trauma, knew that this confrontation was necessary, not a change of mind or make her understand, but to finally speak my truth without worrying about managing her emotional response. I got out of the car, walked up the familiar front steps, and rang the doorbell of the house where I had learned that love was conditional on your willingness to absorb other people's pain. In a few seconds, I would come face to face with the woman who had taught me that children exist to serve their parents' emotional needs, and who was now claiming that I had somehow victimized her by accepting that terrible lesson. The door opened, and there she was, older, grayer, but with the same expectant expression I remembered from childhood, as if she was waiting for me to ask what was wrong so she could tell me all about her latest crisis. But this time, I wasn't 8 years old, and I wasn't there to comfort her. I was there to reclaim my story from someone who was trying to rewrite it in ways that absolved her of responsibility, while blaming me for my own victimization. "Hello, Mom," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "We need to talk."